There's about 2 to 3 fairy forts. Making a full circle around us this moment. Black and white light, full circle. You ready? Hello, my name's Anthony Kerrigan. This is the GhostÉire Channel, and tonight we're joined by the great grandnephew of the famous novelist Bram Stoker. It is the accomplished athlete and coach and author Dacre Stoker. How you doing, Dacre?
Hey, Anthony. So glad to be here. Thank you for having me on your show tonight.
No, it's a real pleasure and it's a real honor to be interviewing there, Dacre. There. We're going to be talking about, today's topics are going to be about the Stoker family, also Dracula, and lastly, at the end of the show, we're going to be talking about Experience Transylvania. Now, if you have any questions, feel free to put them on this live feed. Also, we're coming on, you can also go to our website, www.ghostére.net, go to the contact page, fill in the blanks. If you have any private messages, just put in brackets private message. If you're affiliated with any paranormal team or tourist attraction, feel free to name the group and the tourist organization, and we'll give a shout out to you. Also, we're coming live from this feed on Facebook, but also on our website, www.ghostére.net. By pressing the red button, the GhostÉire channel, you can go live to our feed, our broadcast, and also you can catch up on past shows and what is coming up on the future from that site. Also, we have a competition, folks. Later on, we have the opportunity to enter our Halloween mega draw, and you can win prizes coming up towards Halloween, and that date of that Halloween extravaganza is going to be on the 30th of October. Eugene says, good evening, everyone. How you doing? Thank you, Eugene, from Afterlife Paranormal. So, Dacre, first of all, I'm going to ask you there, can you tell us a bit about yourself, who you are?
Absolutely. As you said, Dacre Stoker, a great grandnephew of Bram Stoker. Bram was one of 7 children, and his youngest brother George was my great grandfather. That makes Bram my great grand uncle. Bram was number 3 in line. What's interesting, Anthony and listeners, is that of those 7 children, only 3 had any offspring, and only 2 have offspring that have members of the family still alive. So Bram had a son. That son Noel had a daughter Anne, and when Anne was married, of course, the name Stoker was gone. But there were three young boys produced by 2 different husbands of Anne, because they both actually, sadly, got killed during World War II. Of those 2 boys, there are 2 still alive, my cousins. They're in their early 80s, and they live in England, and they've got 6 or 7 grandchildren between them all. So they're still, lots going on in Bram's direct lineage. And then in the indirect lineage, George Stoker had 2 kids. The daughter never married. The son actually moved to Montreal, Canada. That's where I was born. He actually helped start the Montreal Stock Exchange, very successful guy. And then he got married and had 3 sons, my dad and his 2 brothers, and there's 6 of us. So, luckily the roots, let's just say, of the Stoker family are healthy. Of all those folks, though, I seem to be the one that is kind of carrying the mantle for the Stoker family. Not that the others don't care, but, my wife is really into genealogy, and we just decided, that if we didn't learn about it and just let other people write about it, number one, other people have a great propensity to get things wrong because they're just trying to sell books and be sensational. Luckily, one of my uncles on my father's side, his brother, was really into being the keeper of the books. Now, this is the part of the family that actually, came from the Killarney area. Right. And so my Uncle Paddy, whose ashes were actually spread on Mount Carrantoul, he was, a Canadian, but he was still a true Irishman. He was the keeper of papers and books and all kinds of things that he recognized that my wife and I, Jenny, were the ones of the family that really cared. And it was kind of sad, but it was helpful. When he was diagnosed with congestive heart failure some years ago, he said, "You've got to come up to Montreal." I moved to South Carolina since before that. And I went back there, and he opened up the vault and handed me all these things to look at. And I brought my scanner, and I scanned all kinds of things that I found really cool letters and some first edition books that were passed down through the family. So I just felt at that point, Anthony, that it was important for somebody in the family to carry on from Uncle Paddy and, help people get the story straight. And so we run this website, bramstokerestate.com, where people, just fans, can go there and check out what we have. Also biographers, film people, and constantly they're asking me, "Hey, help me, we want to get this thing straight. What about Dracula? What about the Nosferatu stuff?" All these things surrounding Bram's life. We now become the experts. So that's what I do now full time. I've been doing it about 10 years after my teaching and athletic coaching career ended. I still have my hand in some of that stuff, but mostly this is where I'm focused, is giving lectures, writing books, being the expert on the family. So I'm here to answer any of your questions and tell you as much as you guys can draw out of me.
Oh, it's going to be amazing, and it's great to have you there. Jonathan from Fermanagh says hi. Hi, Jonathan. How are you doing?
Jonathan, how are you? Yep.
Yes. So we're going to probably talk about the first subject. So I'm going to delve in more into the Stoker family there. I suppose the first question I would like to ask you there, Dacre, what was your great-great-grandparents? Do you have any knowledge about what they were, what they did, and how their style of life was? And that would be
Charlotte. Yeah, Charlotte Stoker and Abraham Sr.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting. Charlotte was born and raised in Sligo. She was a Charlotte Matilda Blake Thornley. She, at the age of, I think, 14 in 1832, almost didn't make it. And without her, obviously, you wouldn't have had any of these things that we're going to be talking about today, myself included. She suffered through the cholera epidemic of 1832. She didn't catch it, but she came this close to catching it. And I'll tell you why and how. So she's a very compassionate person. Um, in 32, half of the town of Sligo either left or died because of this contagious disease.
Mm.
And she she wrote an account of this at Bram's request. She had orally told Bram this story when he was a sickly young boy for 7 years. So we know that Bram needed to be educated and entertained while he was sick and confined to his room. But what is interesting is we've got a record that later on, when she was, Bram was a little older, and the two sisters, Margaret and Matilda, with Charlotte, went to Caen, France, to get better educated in the arts. Bram wrote his mom a letter and said, remember that story you told me about the cholera epidemic? Would you send it to me? Right. I want it for reference. And she typed the whole thing up, and that is now in record in the family papers, the Stoker papers at Trinity. So I've been able to look at the actual account of the cholera epidemic, what she told her son Bram, and it is horrific, but the people in Sligo actually have said that from a medical standpoint and a cultural and social standpoint, this is the most accurate record we have found. So she's a storyteller in her own right, but also a person, someone who got all the facts straight as well. Like her son, she could mix fact and fiction to get it right, and people could understand what really happened. She witnessed somebody being misdiagnosed and buried prematurely.
Oh no! Yeah.
And that means a person, the neighbor there was brought to the hospital. The nurses had mostly all died. They didn't know how to protect themselves from the cholera.
Okay.
And this lady had pain in her stomach, so the husband had wrapped a red scarf around her. Maybe that was something to ease the pain or whatever. And back in those days, with no real hope of anybody surviving the cholera, they were giving just laudanum to ease the pain, to help them pass away peacefully and painlessly. And without being able to diagnose anybody, that these people who were helping run the hospital, these street people, were giving everybody who came in a bed for a couple hours and some laudanum, and then they'd go off to the hole at the end of the town, the big pit, because funerals hadn't been used. So this husband came back from the end of his day of work and said, "Where's the wife?" "Oh, she's passed away. She's in the dead house." Well, there was no dead house. She was in the pit, covered in lime and dirt. So he went to pay his respects, and there he saw, covered with other bodies, a bit of the red scarf. So he started pulling some of the bodies off. He didn't care if he was going to catch the cholera, obviously. And he found that his wife, there was still life in her, and she crawled out. She didn't have the cholera at all, and she didn't catch it for whatever reason. So that's the first little interesting piece, but that enough to set the tone. Then Charlotte said, our neighbor, the parents had died, and their daughter, 2-year-old Mary Sheridan, was crying in the house next door. The parents had been taken off in the cholera cart. And little Charlotte, age 14, tried to get her mother to say, "Let me go and take a hold of little Mary Sheridan." No, you can't go. You'll catch the disease. She snuck out and went anyway. So she went into a house infested with the cholera, picked up the little baby, gave it some water, and brought it home. And of course, her mother then doused them all, cleaned them all with some sort of alcohol. And, Charlotte never got it, but she could have. And that was how close she was to getting it. Now, I don't know if Mary Sheridan died or not, but that was pretty close. So interesting lady. She then moved to Dublin and married Abraham Stoker. That's where Bram got his name. He was christened Abraham as well, but he shortened it to Bram, who was 16 or 17 years older than her. And he was a civil servant, had a good middle-class job at Dublin Castle, and a very serious guy. And of course, his sons, we'll talk about them in a while, but they're off doing their thing. Bram is becoming a student at Trinity once he recovers from his illness. But the one bond that Bram had with his father, even when Bram, who was in university, was they'd go to the theater together. And that was their connection. But what was sad, though, years later, when Bram actually showed an inclination to maybe get a job in the theater writing plays, his father warned him off and said, the theater is no place for you, those no class of people. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean. His dad was trying to set him up to get a good job, which he did at Dublin Castle. He helped Bram get a job as a clerk in the Petty Sessions legal department, which in a way was a good thing for the Stoker family, because when one retires and your pension is quite small, you need somebody making money, and Bram was helping the family. But in another way, Anthony, it was a stifling situation for Bram, who was sort of tried to be, wanting to become a writer. I've actually found his journal at the time and published it. And you could see, while he was this civil servant who was trying to sort of bust out of his shell and practice writing, he also offered to the Dublin Evening Post he said basically, I'll write theatrical reviews for free, because they couldn't offer him any money. So this was his way of kind of exercising the creativity that he had, his writing, poetry, and his writing of reviews of theater, which did in a way create a little stress in the family, because Bram was looked at as being an outsider. 3 brothers, my great-grandfather was one of the 3 doctors in the family, 1 other civil servant, and the 2 sisters became pretty well-known artists. So here is Uncle Bram, going off on his own, and being a bit of this outlier, as I said. But then later on, he's the one everybody knows in the family. So they were good products of a good Protestant family, hardworking family. Charlotte pushed them all to get a good education, and they basically, through notes and letters I've seen, it's like, we're going to pull ourselves up by good education, and that's really what helped them, survive.
What was the characteristics of Bram? How first of all, we'll touch on him. What was he like in his day-to-day life?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because most people don't worry about it. They just, what was the kind of guy that wrote Dracula? But here is what has interested me. I was a school teacher for 25 years. And when I look at people that I taught and then people that I coached at the Olympic level, it was like, I want to know what kind of people they are and how do you get the best out of them. And Bram, I believe, my sort of character analysis, having read everything everybody else has written about him, but most importantly, read everything that he's written, not just books, but letters, articles. So I get his opinions on things. And I see what other people said about him, and I try to cross-reference. And then also I read his journal extensively that I published. So here we go. Short version, Anthony, is that he was one of these guys almost with a split brain. He had this very detail-oriented side of him, the side of him that excelled as a clerk in the Petty Sessions legal department, but also excelled in the way that he got promoted to be the inspector of clerks of all Petty Session clerks around the country. And he wrote a manual when he found out things weren't going very well. Right. So not only is he a guy that is interested in the details, but if he sees something wrong, he's going to do something about it. Okay. That's the kind of guy that he was. But at the same side, the creative side, he loved the world of fantasy. He loved the world of make-believe, of theater, of writing poetry, of writing supernatural. He was also a bit of a philosopher. He was the head of the Philosophical Society of Trinity and Historical Society. So interested in history, interested in philosophy. And so that makes him pretty unique. Some people usually go one way or the other. But Bram was this kind of multidimensional guy. And he really fit the bill when Henry Irving was looking for someone to be a theater manager, somebody that could be a bean counter. Bram actually got a master's in mathematics at Trinity. Somebody could line all the numbers up, but also somebody that could work with him on the creative side of working on scripts and adapting set designs, working with the actors to make sure they all get things right, and the legal side of Bram, writing the contracts and all that kind of stuff.
And Carol says, hi, Anthony, for great visitations here from Wexford. He says he has done a video on Bram Stoker's mother grave at Mount Jerome Cemetery in Dublin.
Yeah, I've been there. That's well, you'll know that, but Cathal, we can tell the others that that's a pretty crowded gravesite, isn't it? Because it's not only got Charlotte in it, but it's got, back in those days, land was pretty scarce and it was expensive to put people in graves. But I don't know if you know this, but they stacked them up in there quite well. Unfortunately, the headstone, as I'm sure Cathal knows, is very worn out. One day I'd love to be able to find the money within the family or whatever to have it redone, because it's very hard to see. You have to come in and kind of bring a water bottle with you and put it on the headstone to be able to read it. But thank you for mentioning that, and I'd love to see your video someday. So if you could put that link to that in the discussion, that would be cool.
Yeah, if you could do that, Carol, that'd be much appreciated there. And we're going to talk about also this gentleman here. So we're talking about Dr. Thornley there, Dacre. It's interesting. I suppose he had a great medical background to him, and would have this been one of the inspirations, I suppose, for blood transfusions and all that at the time? We know that he help Bram in that way with writing Dracula, and also in his own personal life, because there was difficulty with donors assessing which people have different blood groups. Well, did he have that difficulty in his life?
So, it's again, I'm really thankful that you bring up some of these things that don't normally get brought up. Thornley was the eldest in the family, and he was very close with his brother Bram. He was married, and they didn't have children. So what we see here is a guy that is very motivated medically, and he becomes a very well-known doctor. He becomes the head of the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland, but also he didn't necessarily specialize in just one type of medicine. He was advanced in brain surgery, but he was also quite advanced in helping people with mental health problems. I don't know what they called them back in the day. So if you think of the influence of this gentleman that you see on the screen, there's no question in my mind, this is Dr. Seward. That Dr. Seward was not only a doctor dealing with the patients Renfield in the asylum, but he was also a physical doctor, because remember, they had to do brain trephination surgery on Renfield in chapter 21. And they did that because this gentleman, Dr. William Thornley Stoker, provided the notes to his brother Bram on exactly how to do brain trephination surgery. It never makes the movies. What makes the movies is the other part of medical advice that Thornley gave Bram. And Anthony, you mentioned that just a few seconds ago, all the blood transfusions. But the blood transfusions that were being done in the novel Dracula were actually done prior to blood type being figured out. Up until this point, it was quite risky to do blood typing. This was not far removed, and they were still doing bloodletting in those days. As a matter of fact, I found that there were other members of the Stoker family, some on Abraham Sr.'s side, Dr. William Stoker, Edward Alexander Stoker, famous doctors who had written treatises about treating fever with bloodletting. And one of them, Edward Alexander, I think it's a very good chance that he probably did bloodletting on Bram for his childhood illness. But let's get back to Thornley for a moment, because the other interesting thing about him that doesn't get mentioned much, but here's something to think about. It is referenced slightly in the novel. And that's Thornley was an inspector of vivisection. Right. Vivisection is the whole concept of brain surgery for exploration and education to medical students. So what would happening back in the day was they would have dogs and monkeys, and they would cut the skull open, take the skull off, and all the students sort of in the operating theater would be looking down, and the doctor would be kind of poking stuff and seeing what parts of the monkey or the dog would move. And then they would keep the dog, or the monkey in a cage somewhere and see how long he would live. And of course, those are the days they didn't have things like antibiotics, and these normally they would succumb to some kind of germs and you know, whatever would kill them slowly rather than a painless, you know, euthanized type way of death.
Yeah.
So, as a result, Thornley, being the head of the Royal College of Surgeons, got with his colleagues and said, we need to create a way to license legal vivisection. We've got to make sure people apply and say there must be a reason for you to do this exploratory surgery for education purposes, rather than some doctor just really getting good reviews from all his students, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So in the novel Dracula, when I learned this not too long ago, maybe just about a year or so ago, I started doing a word search, which you do if you can get your Dracula, an electronic version. You go to that little search thing and you look up vivisection, you look up surgery, and there are definitely references where Seward says, "Oh, I'd only love to understand more about Renfield. I'd love to do surgery, only if it was necessary."
Yeah.
And then another piece is that the Van Helsing and Seward look at and refer to Count Dracula as the evil scientist who was doing experiments on Renfield by suggesting, power of suggestion, that he would eat these bugs and birds and things. So that this is a very sort of interesting medical connection, more than the obvious, Anthony, more than just the blood transfusion, the brain surgery. There's a subtle undertones of some doctors were not the most, let's just say, ethical, and that they were painting the picture that Count Dracula was this kind of a person, even though he was supernatural as well.
It's just interesting. Cahill says Bram had close connections to Whitby. We'll talk about that just later on. We're going to be talking about Dracula there, but also I suppose I've seen it there that I suppose the story between Lucy and Arthur in the Dracula with the blood transfusion, it's supposed to be to do with something more intimate. You know, it's just one way of saying that.
You're right. You know, when you think of let's just, you know, people say, "Oh, it's a scary book." Back at the time, there was sexual overtones, right? And that was the blood exchanges between the different people, and obviously Lucy and her fiance Homewood. You know, this is, you know, blood's exchange. But also when you think of when Dracula, you know, takes Mina and she, you know, Lucy and then Mina, you know, bears herself, opens up, you know, sort of gives herself to the Count, and there's another fluid exchange. So it really is, you can look at this two ways. Now we'd look at this and say, oh, there's no sexuality at all. And then in the films with all the sheer negligees and Carolyn Monroe and Ingrid Pitt and all those others, certainly. And that was kind of keeping up with the times. But back in those days, this was still a risque story.
I'm going to talk about now as well, your great grandfather, George, Dr. George, and he's an inventor of the ozone therapy, is it, or something like that?
Yeah, isn't that bizarre?
Yeah.
He was a doctor in the Irish medical it was called the Stratford Ambulance, which is the precursor to the Red Cross. And he was sent off, ironically, off to the Balkan region to help the Turkish army when they were battling the Turks against the Russians in the war of 1888, I believe.
Okay.
So that, that's quite common back in those days for the advanced countries with medical military folks to send them off to war to like a MASH unit to help both sides of the war if they can't do it themselves. He also was deployed to South Africa during the Zulu Wars, and while he was there, he learned about the properties of ozone in healing wounds.
Okay.
So when he came back from the Zulu Wars, he went and convinced, and I'm really not good on royalty, but I think some Princess Margaret to put lots of money into creating the first ozone therapy hospital in London. And they had these big machines. They almost looked like these iron lungs, which they would put people in with open wounds and pump in ozone, and it would help. Now, I have to be fair, on both sides of the story, I've looked at medical journals back in the day, and some people thought it was absolute quackery. Some people thought it was the next best thing to sliced bread. So, the jury was still out in those days about what was ozone therapy. But you've got to put it in perspective. So many scientific advances back in the end of the century, the end of the 1900s, and everyone was out there trying to learn things. Charles Darwin in 1859 had published Origin of the Species, so it was only the beginning of understanding, how we were sort of looking at science instead of God to create beings. So, with that, science was trying to catch up and go, oh, wait, now we've got a clean slate. We can start looking at things and not be shunned by the church if we say, well, there's scientific reasons for this now. It's not always just God's way. So science was trying to catch up. And as a result, not just scientifically, but there was almost a rebellion in a way against religion, that you're going to need to justify your place in the all-powerful spot in society. And we'll get to this, I'm sure, Anthony, in our chat. But some of the books Bram was looking at in the London Library were actually written by men of the cloth about superstition, and other things of the occult that normally you would not think a man of the cloth would introduce to the world, because normally they would say, that's forbidden. You don't go there. Rather than trying to be open-minded to say, look, we're not so closed-minded as an institution, but we're open-minded. So that's interesting sideline to all of our discussions.
It's interesting how the Buddhists had an influence, and it's obviously, as it mentioned, great-grandmother Charlotte then, but also the Buddhists, they would have influenced Bram in his writings as well. Leanne, how are you doing, sis? She says, Carol, daily obsessed with your channel, watch it all the time. We're just going to do the lotto draw now. I don't know if there's a bit of trouble on Facebook there, because I don't know if we've come in, if people are seeing our live there at the moment, but there seems to be comments coming in anyway. But I'm going to draw out two names from the lotto jar, the lottery jar we'll see here. And the first name is Eugene. We're going to put your name down. I'm going to put another second name down to make sure that we're in. We're going to do the competition later on. If you're still on, Eugene. Cahill, you're second. Cahill, I know you're commenting, so you have a good chance of going in if Eugene is not around. I'll just do a third just in case. And the third one is Jennifer. Forget Jennifer, that's my missus. That's my wife there. Fourth one is Jonathan as well. So the next subject we're going to be talking about is obviously the Dracula, so we're going to be talking about that. Dacre, can you tell us, do you know what brought the idea of, what led to the inspiration? I know you talked about the priests and the Holy Church, but was there any other inspiration for Dracula? Any other people?
Yes. And we'll get to that, but can I just respond to Cathal and say thank you? Yeah. I'll take you up on your offer, and let's get together at some point. And I know that Anthony will connect us by email, because that would be really cool if we could collaborate to help get the grate cleaned up. But yes, I do come to Dublin at least once a year, so we get that figured out.
Yeah, that'd be great to be done. Yes.
Yeah, that'd be very cool.
Yeah. So we're actually, me and the children going actually grave rubbings tomorrow with the children, which is rubbing that paper off the gravestones just to see what the
sure.
It's great time. So they're all coming, they're still live, so everyone's interested. They're not actually commenting, which is great as well. People are just watching. I was going to say, so to talk about Dracula now, and
let's do that. Yeah.
The inspirations. Was there any other inspirations behind it?
So let's do this, since we've got some live audience participation, Anthony. And this is the teacher me coming out. So before I answer the question, all right, let's kind of play with your listeners a little bit. I'm going to tell you there's two people or two characters in Bram's life that were inspirations for his Count Dracula. and one figure. So 2 people, 1 figure. Any idea, put it in the chat, of who do you think maybe were any of those people or the figure in Bram's life? Because here's what Bram did a lot, is he merged characteristics of different people, different places, different events, and made them real in his story, Dracula. And his Count Dracula is a perfect example of that. So anybody want to hazard a guess as to any of the people or figure that went into, and Catherine, his mother, well, you know what? You're close. His mother, I believe, is one of the inspirations for Matilda, the modern woman, Mina, and his sister Matilda were, Matilda and Charlotte, I believe, were inspirations for the modern woman Mina in the story. One is because his mother knew how to type in a typewriter, as did Mina in the novel, which was very new and actually quite advanced for the time. But let's anybody want to hazard a guess about Dracula?
I'm just going to put one whilst people are thinking now. That's it, folks. If you can think of any people that would have any things that were inspiration for Dracula, I was thinking between the time frame, the Irish famine. I mentioned bodies building up and vampires and people hungry. There's a story you probably know yourself with the Brown Man of Killarney, associated with eating the bodies off in the graveyard there, because obviously he was hungry. And there's supposed to be a story of a man buried who used to sleep in the coffins there, John Drake. He used to be nice during the day, and in evening times he used to sleep in the coffins there at Muckus Abbey there. Is that any, I don't know, but
well, listen, you've touched on something that I believe Bram absorbed organically, which is all the Irish stories, Irish folklore, and I will not be able to pronounce them right. I don't want to get crucified. Abhartach.
That's the one, yes.
And also Derg Du. That's one other. And actually, Derg Du, a little plug. I used Derg Du with J.D. Barker as a character in Dracula, the prequel to Dracula. But all of those, and let's just put it all in the category of Irish superstition, would have been just part of, let's just call it the little stars floating around Bram's head. But let's get to this. Vlad the Impaler. All right. Some people say, no, not at all. Absolutely he was. And here's why. Here's my evidence, because I'm playing now literary forensic detective. First of all, I told you about the church stuff, and I told you about Bram being a Protestant and churchgoer and so on. There is no question that my mind that Henry Irving playing the role of Mephistopheles, the devil, in Faust, was the inspiration for Count Dracula. This is the devil made me do it. The devil creature is what is so strong in religion, because he's the Antichrist, right? But Oscar Wilde's mother wrote a book that was in Bram's private library called Ancient Superstitions of Ireland. And I've got a copy of the book. I bought it off A Books. And it's got a reference part that says, Irish folklore and superstitions are very similar to those of Transylvania, who has similar stories of vampires and werewolves and witches. But also, she mentioned Emily Gerard, the Scottish writer. Madame Gerard has written an account of it. So when I look at sources, it starts with Lady Jane Wilde, and it moves to Emily Gerard, who wrote all about Transylvanian superstitions and the devil and how you kill a vampire and how they work, and the words Nosferatu instead of Goy. He then went to Whitby for his holiday. And in Whitby, he actually went into the library, and we've seen his signature signing out certain books. And one of them was by William Wilkinson, An Account of Principalities of Wallachia, Moldavia. Wallachia is the province right next to Transylvania. Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracula, was a prince of Transylvania, of Wallachia. Bram simply moved him to Transylvania because of this series of stories that Emily Gerard wrote all about Transylvanian superstitions being similar to Irish. And then he went to the London Library. He got one more book by a lawyer in London called James Samuelson, who wrote a book called Romania, Its Past and Present. that mentioned half a page on Vlad the Impaler, who did so many atrocities to both his own countrymen and his enemies that he earned the nickname the Devil. So the Wilkinson book mentioned Dracula meaning devil in the Wallachian language. The Samuelson book mentioned devil, and so did Lady Jane Wilde and Emily Gerard. So there you go, 4 sources all converge, and now you've got Henry Irving, who has that look in his body, his look in his costume, both on and off the stage. So this is a merged character that Bram does so well, and puts them together from different sources to make his Count Dracula.
Cahill says Bram visited a burial ground in Dublin in Ballabo, aka the suicide plot, as a child. He also adds Oscar Wilde's sister's grave is in County Longford, Francesca. So the locations, I suppose, as well, would they be all similar as well, merged? As you said, there's something to do with Scotland, isn't there? With illustrations, isn't that correct? Or
yeah, so here we go. Look, you guys can buy, if you're interested in this, and maybe Cathal has this and others maybe get into it. Go to Amazon and you'll see Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula, written by Elizabeth Miller and Robert 18 Passang. These notes live in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. The museum allowed these notes, 125 pages, to be printed as Bram's handwriting, and then they transcribed them. I did exactly the same thing with Dr. Elizabeth Miller in the Lost Journal. So those 2 books are like incredibly good sources, because you can look at exactly what Bram was looking at. And as a good sort of student, as a clerk of petty sessions, Bram listed all his resources. And so that's how we know what books he took out of Whitby, what books he got from the London Library, and exactly what books he was looking at. So when we talk about places and locations and what happened, in his notes, he started to write Dracula having the Count arrive in Dover before he took his holiday in Whitby in the summer of August 1890. He actually was setting the story in Austria, Styria, the same place Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu set Carmilla. So he was influenced, even though we don't see him writing down, because Carmilla's written here, I'm going to put Dracula there. You don't have to do that. Bram was already thinking, people love this story. If they've already believed that there's Lord Ruthven over there in Styria, I'm just going to put my story there. I've already, Sheridan Le Fanu has already done half the work for me. But he got so taken in Whitby with the resources he saw there that he crossed those things out in his notes, and he had the whole story moved to Transylvania, and instead of Dover, he's got Whitby. In Whitby, chapter 6, 7, and 8, all these places are exactly the same, and almost the names are the same. Royal Crescent, the Crescent. He stayed at Royal Crescent, and Mina and Lucy and Mina's mother, Lucy's mother, stayed at the Crescent. Same with Billington, the lawyer, the train station, all these things the same. And then London, Purfleet, Exeter, the London Zoo. They actually, Van Helsing and Seward actually stopped in Spaniards Inn, and also one of the other places, which is now, it was a hotel back in the day. It'll come to me. So all these places set as real places, Bram would tweak them a little bit, change the addresses just a tad. But Anthony, it's just because he wanted the story to seem real. The train schedules were real. The trip from London to Paris to Munich to Vienna to Klausenberg to Bistrica. I've done all of that. We'll talk about that in a while in Transylvania. I take people and we follow the footsteps. They love that kind of stuff, to see what it was like now, what's it like back in the day when we read it. He never went there, but he got the accounts right because so many people did go there.
I just got Carol says, have you been to Golders Green Cemetery in London to see Bram's ashes in the urn?
Yeah, actually 2012, we had a 100th anniversary of Bram's death. There was a big conference and a large group of us made the pilgrimage. Dr. Bill Hughes, Christopher Frayling, myself, and Elizabeth Miller all said some very nice words at Golders Green in front of his ashes. Funnily enough, his son's ashes are also mixed in with Bram's, and I got lucky. You know, you get that with the name. That one of the guys that works at Golders Green, he pulled me aside and said, "I've got to show you a photograph." And so he showed me a photograph of the urn, and you're not allowed to touch them. You can't turn them around. But he said the back side of the urn, here's the photo. Because in 1912, when Bram died, his name was etched on the urn, and then they turned it around and added Bram Stoker and Noel Stoker when he died in 1962. So I've got the picture that shows the back of it as well, and also the book of the registration book that shows that Florence Stoker, Bram's wife, was actually planning to be cremated and interned with the boys in the urn, but chose instead to have her ashes sprinkled on the Garden of Life, eternal garden, the rose garden at Golders Green. So isn't that? I mean, it's nice. I mean, maybe she doesn't want to be confined by the urn, or maybe she's had enough of those messy boys after a while. She wants to be with the roses.
We know what it can happen that way, I suppose. But their thought and mind and consciousness there, I suppose. Cal says, very interesting. Love all the stories of Dracula, says Jonathan. I'm going to touch on this, though, as the movie Nosferatu. There's a new movie coming out in December. I think it's actually Christmas Eve. I'm not too sure there, But the original there, what do you think, how has that been portrayed since the novel was made? How have these different genres of films, these different remakes, have they been good? Have they been bad? Which ones have stuck out kind of for you, yourself personally?
How long do you have? I mean, literally.
I suppose Nosferatu there, 1922.
Well, let's just focus on that one for a moment because, and I'll just say this, here's a plug. In 2022 was the 100th anniversary of Nosferatu, right? That's just pretty cool when you think 100 years that the film started. I mean, the book is now 127, right? Yes. And Nosferatu, even though it was an illegal pirated version of Dracula, I get to that, touch that in a moment, it was very advanced to be able to pull off, a film back in those days. But the Germans were very, very advanced at the time. I wrote an article along with my son, who's a PhD student, so he writes much better than I do, but I do all the research. And we put it together for Scream magazine. And it was all about, the Nosferatu legal proceedings from the Stoker family's point of view. And I wanted to set it straight by saying, look, and I won't promise I won't take too long on this, but Bram Stoker made sure that he protected the dramatic rights of Dracula by doing a staged reading at the Lyceum Theatre 8 days before the novel came out. As you've all heard me all talk about, Bram was a clerk in the Petty Sessions Legal Department. He wrote a legal manual for all of Ireland. He was asked to come to the bar in London, but decided not to. He wanted to still be a theatre manager. He knew the legalities of all this stuff. He had staged readings for his other books as well at the Lyceum Theatre, only as a way to protect the dramatic rights for the Lord Chamberlain's office. So when he died in 1912, he left to his wife, not a ton of money, but he left her the rights to Dracula, which then made her a lot of money because she made sure that when Prana Films created this film and did not even ask her for a license, that she convinced the Incorporated Society of Authors in London, of which Bram was a member of, to represent her in this 2.5-year battle, which they did, and they paid the legal bills for a German lawyer in Berlin. And all the letters live in the British Museum Library. And that's where I got all my references from, the letters back and forth between the German lawyer, the Incorporated Society of Authors, and Mrs. Stoker. What we don't have, unfortunately, and I actually found a film historian in Germany who was equally as interested as I was in what was the German side of all this. He said, Dacre, I think all the letters have been destroyed during the war and the bombings and fires and so on. I could not find it. I've been searching for 5 years. So what we don't have, unfortunately, is why did Prana Films think they could get away with it? And all I can say is, and this is just conjecture, that there was obviously tensions between the British and the Germans after World War One.
Mm.
And film was so early in those days. It was just the beginning, the infancy of film. But would anybody have thought of a copyright infringement between book to film? And I also discovered, with the help of Holger Mandel in Germany, that this was the second book to film adaptation Piranha Films did. They did Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, and they also didn't get any rights for that, but they didn't get caught.
Right.
So who knows? But anyway, here's my thought. I am glad that she prevailed in the court of law to set legal precedent for authors like myself and all the ones in the last 127 years. But I'm also glad that all copies did not get destroyed, as per the court in Berlin ordered, because Prana was bankrupt. Because if all copies of that film had been destroyed, it would have been a shame, because it was really an interesting look back at history. It was the first depiction of a Dracula that even looked like Bram Stoker's Dracula. And it has been remastered and rescored with music so many times. It's been redone a couple of times. And Robert Eggers has got another version coming out really soon, which is cool. So, I mean, it does sound cliche. It's hard to kill a vampire. It's hard to kill a movie, even though it was pirated. But it's a vampire film. And it just got such a story and a cool mystique that goes with it, that, again, Florence Stoker came out just fine financially after the sale of the dramatic rights to Dean and Balderston for the stage play. And then the stage play's rights were sold to Universal Films in 1931. And she did very well there. Bela Lugosi, I thought, did a great job in a movie that didn't have a great budget.
That was the question I was going to ask you. Who has played, in your own aspect, the best Dracula that they could do, or who's been directed the best Dracula, and even who has been in plays and film, who's played the best part of their characters, like Lucy or
Well,
Harkins.
I'll tell you this. I'm not good with all the other names. I do present occasionally, and I've come back from Derby in England, where they had the 100th anniversary of the first time Dracula was presented on stage, 1924. So 2024. And I just presented Dracula from novel to stage to screen. And I did this thing where I showed film clips. And at the end of it, I said, okay, let's all vote. And we couldn't do all of them because there's so many. But I think the big ones that we narrowed it down to, because Lugosi played Dracula twice, and only twice, but he was on stage many, many times. And funnily enough, here's a plug to a guy that I just met, John Eastwood. He came to this festival. He's the great grandson of Edmund Blake, who played the first Dracula on stage ever. So it wasn't Lugosi who was number one. Yes. Edmund Blake was. So I got to meet my counterpart, which is very cool. We had a great time hanging out and chatting, and we're working on some stuff together to bring stories alike. So I would say Lugosi was out there. Christopher Lee, obviously, because he played it 7 times. And then you've got guys like Louis Jourdan, Jack Palance, Gary Oldman,
you mentioned Gary Oldman.
Luke Evans. You've got all kinds of different, and then you go into the comedy side, David Niven, Leslie Nielsen. There's so many guys, but if you had to ask me to narrow it down, I'm going to start by narrowing it down to 3, Anthony, because I've got to give a nod to stage and screen of Bela Lugosi, and then Frank Langella was the only other guy that played stage and screen. Now, Langella was not till 79, so you got lots more advances in technology. So those are 2 guys I got to give a heads up to. And then Christopher Lee, just because his persona was so great, and he broke ground in having to be somewhat kind of sexy on stage, that kind of sexual side, that tension that he had, but also he was still a badass, really horrifying, strong, big guy. And then Gary Oldman, who I just love him as an actor. He transforms in so many different ways, but he also had the advantage of incredible costumes, to which they won an Oscar, and great special effects. So it's really hard to say which actor played the best, because when they have all these different resources. But those are my top 3, 4, Lugosi, Langella, Lee, and Oldman. And I won't go any farther than that because it's just not fair.
Yeah, it's interesting. You said like it's those in between years, like you said, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. We won't have Nosferatu there, and then suddenly Gary Oldman. It won't be the there's a big difference in between, as you said, Christopher Lee, but the kind of sexual side to it, and I suppose that's why it's romanticized now these days with like films like Twilight and all that. It's kind of interesting there as well. So
let me give you a quick one on this though, because I know your people love inside story. I've done my Stoker and Stoker talks all over the world, and one of the great thrills was doing it with Mr. J.V. Hart. Jim Hart was the screenwriter for the '92 Coppola film. He was the screenwriter for Contact, for Hook, all kinds of great. He's an incredible screenwriter. But I had to conjure up the guts to say, Jim, Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992. You had Gary Oldman, Anthony Hopkins, all-star cast. Why the hell did you turn it into a romance? I said, you had everything. And Bram Stoker did not write a romance novel. And I did that not when he was on stage. And we had a chuckle about it because he said, look, Dacre, here's the thing. You've got to look at what studios want. And you kind of touched on it, Anthony. When you look at Anne Rice and Interview the Vampire, and you look at Stephen King's Salem's Lot in the 70s, and then you look at the Doldrums, and then you look at 92, what had to happen was you got to get people back and kind of believing and coming back to studios to believe the vampire movies would be good. And how do you do that? Got to have the women want to go. And the women like to go to see romance. They'll drag their husbands and boyfriends along. And the boyfriends like to see, maybe there's some hot women.
Yes.
Really, come on, let's be honest. All the Dracula films with all the sheer negligees, Ingrid Pitt, Carolyn Monroe, and all the other ladies. I mean, they're incredible. So you got to have a little piece of that. If it's just an all-out horror, it's just another horror film. So he said, I just felt to get the studio to buy into my screenplay, it had to have romance. And so he did something very interesting in the Coppola film, which I thought was ingenious. Much like Bram took Emily Gerard's superstitions and stories of Vlad the Impaler from Wilkinson and Samuelson, he went into Romanian myth and found the story of Vlad the Impaler's wife, who committed suicide by jumping out the window of the fortress into the Argeș River because the invading Ottoman Empire shot an arrow through the window with a note that said, we'll be careful, we'll take care of you, we'll be humane to you as we capture you if you just give up. And she said, the hell with that. So she committed suicide. And Dracula comes home after battling, victorious for Christianity, and finds out that the church, the Christian church, will not bury his wife in a consecrated grave because she committed a mortal sin. So he rebels against the church, stabs the cross, drinks the blood, becomes a vampire, seeks revenge, wants to live forever to try to find his reincarnated wife. That's the first 3 minutes of the Coppola film. Sorry, guys, if I spoiled it if you haven't seen it. But that's what Jim Hart made up to make the story relevant and to get it bought by a studio. So there we go. Sometimes you need that in it, a man's and woman's love as well, and a man's love there. I read all of Anne Rice's books. I thought they were very good. So is Jonathan. Eugene says most people want eternal love. I think that's true there. But as I was saying there as well, one thing that I forgot to touch upon is Bram Stoker's other novels. Was there anything that is in comparison to what Dracula was, and what was his other writings like? Good question, because I forgot you had asked me about Cruden Bay, Scotland, and I've got to say yes. He wrote Dracula and other books while he was on summer holiday in Cruden Bay, Scotland, which is north of Aberdeen, small fishing village, kind of like Whitby was, like years before Bram went there. Whitby was a little too busy for Bram. He wanted something very remote that had a telegraph and a phone and post office so he could stay in touch with Henry Irving even on his summer holiday. But he wrote a book that I believe is second to Dracula, and I highly recommend it. It's called The Mystery of the Sea.
Right.
And it is supernatural. It's got some ghost kind of stuff in it. It's very good. And just like Whitby, you can go to Dracula and walk around Whitby with your book novel, Dracula, chapter 6, 7, and 8, and find all the spots. You can do the same with Mystery of the Sea all around Aberdeenshire and Cruden Bay and find all the spots that he's mentioned in the book. So that's the next best. I think the Water's Mouth, the river called the Water's Mouth, where there was a horrible drowning there, and Bram in real life, and Bram fictionalized that, and it's a story of smuggling, which really was a big deal at the time because it was coastal, and what was happening is the Brits would have port and wine and whiskey coming over from France. They would be smuggled into Scotland and then taken down to England. So he capitalized on all that. One other quick thing before I forget, though. Dracula's Guest is a good short story. And if you guys want to read any of Bram's short stories and not have to pay anybody for them because they're all in public domain, go to bramstoker.org. I don't run it, but a university professor does, and he's done a great job of putting together all Bram stories. You can read it if you don't mind reading on your computer. You can find Dracula's Guest, Mystery Sea, all that stuff for free, no charge. Dracula's Guest, though, was actually once part of Dracula.
Okay.
No question. I found the evidence. It was part of the typescript. It is the story of Jonathan Harker, who had stopped in Munich for the night because of the train schedules, and Bram did have the accurate train schedules, had to spend the night and a day. So while he was there, he took a ride to the countryside, and let's just say all hell breaks loose. And he also was going to go to a night at the opera and visit the Munich Dead House. Those were the first chapters of the novel that were edited out at the typescript phase because of length. You can buy Dracula's Guest and other weird stories, or you can just get it on this website I just told you. But that to me, other than Dracula, Mystery of the Sea, Water's Mouth, Dracula's Guest are must-reads.
Oh yeah, I must be checking out those there as well. We're going to come before the last topic, which is going to be Experience Transylvania. We have the competition. So first of all, I think it's Eugene. You were up first there. So we got this little fella is the Ghost Boy. And typically there, I don't know if you know this there, Dacre, that we named him, this is our son, mine and my wife's son, and we named him Stoker.
Oh, cool.
So,
very cool.
So there's two Stokers in between, squashing me there, you know. So
nice.
Here it is. We have to guess, folks, well, Eugene, anyway, which doorway, which gravestones is the Ghost Boy going to walk in front of. So Eugene, you got a choice of blue, red, orange, or green. Pick one of those. You can have a go as well, Dacre. Which colour do you reckon? Blue, red, orange, or green?
I gotta go green.
Green for Dacre. Okay, and Eugene is going for red. Okay, second time lucky there, Eugene. So we'll find out near the end of the show there. If you were any luck with that, you can enter our Halloween mega draw. So the next topic we're going to talk about is Experience Transylvania. And first of all there, Dacre, can you tell us who runs the group and how long has it been running for, the Experience Transylvania agency?
Sure. So it's a travel agency that two sisters that I've met about 4 years ago now. They were originally born and raised in Transylvania. One of them moved to Sweden, where she married a Swedish guy, Gloria. And so Gloria Andersson is a former Romanian living in Sweden. Her and her husband started this business, but they've been doing the business for at least 10 years. And primarily they take Swedish groups to visit their country, and now they've started moving out to other countries. They've gone beyond visiting cool sites in Romania. I helped them actually bring people to Whitby and to Cruden Bay, Scotland, and this past year also to Ireland. The other sister, Nora, has been working in the tour business and also as a translator for I think the same time as her sister. And she also works part-time doing gigs, in these river cruises. And so both of these sisters have experience, somewhere between 8 and 10 years in the travel business, very organized, very detailed, which I love when it comes to running tour businesses that way. But the idea is that they found me because I was doing some touring events. I'd come to Transylvania just doing research with another guy, Hans de Roos, a Dutch guy. And then I would come over to speak at tourist branding conferences, or there's a medieval festival that I came to as their guest speaker and talking all about Bram and what he knew about Romania through the books that he did his research on. And I'd get on television and I'd go to Dublin Castle and they'd make a big deal about it. So, I was becoming well known, when Stoker shows back up in Romania, because Bram never went there. And look what he has done to this country. In a funny way, it's kind of bittersweet. He's sort of created the Hollywood icon of Count Dracula out of their Prince Dracula, who fought the invading Ottomans for 7.5 years in a way that he was saving Christian Europe. Now, you got to bear with me for a little bit while I try to explain the look of this part of Europe. So you've got the Black Sea, huge big body of water that Ukraine borders on, Russia does, Bulgaria and Romania in the middle. And then right across the Black Sea, of course, is Turkey and what was the massive Ottoman Empire. So, at the time, the evil, Ottomans, the Muslims were over on this side of the world, and that body of water separated. And then when you come over across the water, you have what's called the